Fellow builders of good, thank you for tuning in to the Build Good Fundraising podcast. Fundraising isn't easy, but it should be simple. So on this podcast, we take the mystery out of raising money. Now, on every episode, we coach you how to build your fundraising like a flywheel. The flywheel has 5 steps. Number 1 is listening to donors. Number 2 is engaging them. Number 3 is asking the right people for the right things. Number 4 is celebrating every gift. And number 5 is reporting back. Now, if you master the 5 parts of the flywheel, your fundraising flywheel will start to spin reliably with less effort on your part. Your revenue will grow, and so will your career as a fundraiser. Every week, we focus on one part of the flywheel, and today, we're kind of focusing on a bunch of them because we're focusing on storytelling, which has implications for almost every area of the flywheel. So welcome everybody to Build Good Live. Those of you who are in the room, we are here with Olga Moshinsky Woltman. I'm sorry, did I get that right, Olga?
You got it right, pretty close.
Okay. So humans are wired for stories, right? But storytelling can be super challenging. Good story is kind of part art, part science. We all know that some stories are really good and some stories are just kind of like average, but like what makes the difference, right? Like what makes a story make you feel something in your bones? What is it about a story that can make you tear up, that can make you feel nostalgic, that can make you feel like home? We know from lots of studies that the hormones that our brains release when we hear stories can even heal. So what is it about a good story that can do that? And then what is it about an average story where we just tune out and be like, this is so boring. I don't want to listen to this person any longer. That's what we're talking about today. And Olga has worked with some of the most inspiring and transformative causes, including American Heart Association, the ALS Association, American Diabetes Association, and the Special Olympics. We're going to talk about how to make stories impactful, how to help connect donors to the stories we tell, and also how stories can help us attract and retain staff, which is a big issue. So let's get right into it on Build Good Live. Here's our conversation with Olga Moshinsky Woltman. Olga, we've been LinkedIn buddies for a long time, and this is the first time we're actually like talking like face to face, so to speak. So thanks for doing this.
Thrilled to be here.
I'm going to ask the question everybody's asking when they heard that you worked at the ALS Association, which is about the Ice Bucket Challenge. And I'm sorry if you get this question all the time. What is the legacy of the Ice Bucket Challenge at that organization today?
Well, a lot of the funds that were raised through Ice Bucket Challenge were invested in research, and we're just starting to see some of that come to fruition. So you're starting to see some of the drugs that have been in research coming through the pipeline to FDA. So it's really making a very tangible difference. As you know, research is a lengthy timeline. It's not something that happens overnight. Sometimes it takes a decade or more, and it costs a lot of money. So we're starting to see some of that bear fruit.
Yeah. Now, the Ice Bucket Challenge was this crazy viral thing, and we're talking about storytelling. It kind of relates because the Ice Bucket Challenge became the story that everybody could tell about themselves, and like everybody around you was doing it. So it was even a story of like, I'm part of my community. People like us do things like this, right? It sort of had that effect. It seems like a one-off. Or do you think that good stories can create that sort of movement?
Well, I'm just going to be real straight and not to disappoint anybody, but you can have an amazing story and odds are it will not go viral. So viral is sort of this moment where all the pieces align, all the stars align, and it comes together. So no matter how good the story is, chances are it's not going to be spreading like wildfire. I think with viral moments, what you see a lot is it's not just about the cause, the mission, or even the story we're telling. It's a reflection of us. And when you get to do something that's fun and you get to show off to all your friends that you're doing it, I think that sparks a lot of interest and kind of starts picking up. And we're seeing that with a lot of TikToks challenges and things like that. So
yeah. You said something interesting that we'll probably weave throughout the conversation, which is that it's a reflection of us, which is like good stories often are the stories we resonate with are often a reflection of us because we can maybe see ourselves in it. Maybe it's a bit aspirational sometimes, or maybe it's nostalgic. So let's get into the roadmap for today. Is first, we're going to focus on what makes a good story, a great story, versus just kind of like an average story, because there are some real tactics that you can teach us about how to advance the plot of a story and how to make it interesting and how to create tension and all of those sorts of things. Number two is we're going to then talk about how to use those stories to engage donors. And number three is we're going to talk about how to use those stories to engage staff and retain staff. So let's just start with story. Why are some stories able to move us and bring us to tears, and other stories are just boring?
Right. So to kind of, you mentioned we're wired for story at the top of the hour, and it's absolutely true. Like, I have to kind of cheat and do Google research, but everything from oxytocin. So oxytocin is released in our brains when we hear stories that we connect with, which is the same as holding an infant. It, creates empathy, creates connection. Dopamine, which engages our emotions. Cortisol, which connects to our memories. I think they've tracked brain, and it activates different parts of the brain. So when we hear stories, we connect in a way that statistics, factual information just doesn't get through to us. So when we say we're wired for stories, we actually are wired for stories. So if holding your newborn releases the same hormone as hearing a really compelling story, that's something to consider. I love your question on what makes for a compelling story versus what makes for just fine story or mediocre story or just unimpactful story. And I think there's a few elements that we can start pulling back. So first of all, the narrative arc. I won't drag us down the rhetoric rabbit's hole, but I think when we talk about story, if a story is sequential and it's this happened and then this happened and then this continued to happen, it doesn't really have enough drama. If you think of your favorite show, if you think of your favorite movie, your favorite book, there's always ups and downs. So the narrative arc has to go up and down. It sort of embrace the negative, embrace the obstacles in the way. So just really creating a narrative that takes us on a journey. Pretty much every story that you ever hear or ever read fits into one of the 7 basic plots. So there are things like rags to riches or overcoming a monster, rebirth, those types of things. And it's not to sit down before we put pen to paper to really think, wait, which narrative am I working with? But it's just keeping in mind that the story has to have the peaks and valleys. It has to have, to kind of advance your story forward, you have to have obstacles in the way. Otherwise, you're simply going from point A to point B. So any thoughts on that? I'll keep going.
So you mentioned the basic 7 story plots. This comes from screenwriting, and if people are interested after this, and I know a lot of us on this call are really nerdy in a good way when it comes to fundraising and story. But a lot of the plots that we end up, I think, naturally writing on fundraising is sort of the overcoming the monster, which is like, this person is in a really tough situation. They're up against it. The odds are all stacked against them, right? They've lost their job. They've become homeless. This, and we get to not necessarily be the hero, but we get to alongside them tackle the problem and together overcome this monster, right? That's a very common story in fundraising. Another one, the rags to riches, is a little bit less common, maybe on the surface, but actually a lot of newsletter stories are rags to riches, which is the overcoming the monster story, but it's more as in like, this person was in this situation, and then after the organization helped them, they ended up in this other situation. And maybe if you're listening, you're thinking, well, our stories aren't that dramatic. Like, maybe we're a library foundation, or maybe we're a hospital foundation, but it's not a trauma hospital. Like, people just kind of come here to get like normal hospital stuff taken care of. How can we still infuse the sense of interest and drama without being fake, right? Like, we don't want to create fake drama. How can we bring this interest into a story when we think that the cause that we have is a little bit harder to sort of tell that dramatic story?
Yeah, I mean, drama is a relative term, right? But not everything is going to be, fires blazing. And, I was actually going to say the rebirth or the story of redemption is another great one. I think where the drama comes in is where we connect to the values and emotions. So in telling a good story, it's not that it has to be at a grand scale, but it's overcoming and how somebody felt. It's infusing that emotional, authentic piece into the narrative that I think is really important. And it's really kind of taking a creative mind and what angle of it or what aspect of it will really resonate with it. A lot of the a lot of this emotion, a lot of this drama comes from language and choice of words. There's certain words that just viscerally, dare I say, word moist immediately causes a visceral reaction among most English speakers. So why is that? We don't know. It just does. So I think it's kind of being very deliberate with the language we use, and a very choppy short sentences narrative is going to be a very different than something that's more fluid. So that's kind of where the art piece comes in, right? And a good writer following that narrative story arc can really craft something beautiful. And taking and amplifying the small moment, I think that's where it's at. When I talk to colleagues and clients about collecting the stories and not much is happening, right? Like there's expectation of, well, what's actually happening, but it's really probing on things like, how did you feel in this moment? What are your hopes and aspirations? What are your dreams? And we talked early on, and we'll continue coming back to reflection of self. It's relatable. It relates to our values. It relates to ourselves. You can really understand and empathize with what it's like to dream of something, or what it's like to feel bad about something, or what it's like to have circumstance in the moment. So
yeah, if I'm a fundraiser and I'm tasked with creating the next appeal or newsletter, I've got to tell a story of some sort for our donor communications piece.
yep.
What kind of questions can I ask myself, or can I ask the person I'm working with for the story? What sorts of questions can I ask before I even write the story to find the right angle, to find that bit that will bring in a lot of interest and a little bit of friction and tension that has to be overcome?
Yeah, so I think the first question I ask myself is, to what end? If you're writing a story, like, you can write a beautiful, compelling, and emotional story, but if it doesn't lead somebody to conclusion that you want them to take away, it's just that. It's a great story, but it doesn't lead you towards something. So as a writer and a strategist, you have to really consider, to what end? What do we want them to take away? I'm a strong believer in mobilizing colleagues to be your story gatherers, your army of eyes and ears on the ground that provide you with story leads. And not everyone can tell the story, but everyone keep an eye out and alert you to something. And as a storyteller and marketer, it is your job to take that and to think about, what is the right angle and what is the right approach and what elements of it you want to spotlight. In terms of questions, I mean, I think when I interview a subject for a story that doesn't have that strong, aggressive action to it, the types of questions you ask is more about the inner lives. And I think where it really does create a compelling and dramatic narrative, first of all, those questions can be very uncomfortable. And when you start going there, once you kind of push just a little bit past the polite conversation and, follow up with, well, how did you feel? What was that like? You really start teasing out some real and very authentic emotions. And, we hear the word vulnerability a lot. I think it's frankly overused, but that raw vulnerability on display is what really compels us and connects with us as humans.
So rather than just asking, okay, and then what happened next? It's like, okay, how did you feel? What was going through your head at that moment?
Like, if you were talking to your closest friend and they were sharing something important to them, what are the questions you'd ask to allow them to speak, right? So, and
Yeah.
that's where I think it's very, I don't know if it's cultural, if it's just the human condition, but it's very uncomfortable to ask those questions. What was the hardest part? So you're almost trying to push just a little bit past that boundary of the comfort zone. We may want to come back to the ethics piece of it, Mike, and talk about that as well, because certainly it's a consideration that plays a role. But you definitely have to ask the questions that are not the obvious small talk.
Yeah, for sure. And let's quickly touch on the ethics. The ethics of it being, when you're interviewing somebody, you really want to ask those questions. And the person you're interviewing needs to be comfortable, of course. It's your job to make them feel comfortable. You kind of want to stay away from this vulnerability porn, right? Which is just like pushing a person to tears just because we know it's going to get a good quote, which is just the last thing we want to do. What are some ways that we can honor the person, honor their story, assuming the person wants to share their story? Let's just start with that assumption. The person wants to share their story without pushing them too much, and maybe it's as simple as they get to approve the story at the end and get to edit and take out anything they want. But what are some of those tactics?
So I think first and foremost, what you said about permission and their willingness to share it, absolutely. Because, some people heal and thrive by sharing their stories, but for others, it's actually a hardship to overcome. And it's knowing if you're causing additional pain to somebody, or if recollecting a story is actually something that they fully embrace. And, just being attuned to that at a human level, when you're working with patients' families, for example, for a lot of health causes, some families readily, they will absolutely share. They want to share it with the world. And others are very private about it. So it's picking and choosing who you speak to. I think it comes down to dignity of the subject and how you tell the story. If you're presenting them as an object of pity, or if you're really showing the full dignity and humanity of the person or people you're describing, I think that's key. Additional ethics certainly come into play when we're working with underage children, or if we're talking to somebody with an intellectual disability and things like that. So that's something to consider. And then I think, last thing that comes to mind is permission and ethical today may change tomorrow. For those of us who are parents in particular, story of a 5-year-old may be just fine. When that 5-year-old is 13 and a teenager, that may no longer be fine. So I think there's this nuance to consider.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to talk a little bit about boring stories and how to make them interesting. I know we kind of did that already, but maybe a better, I don't want to say boring causes. I don't think any cause is boring, but sometimes fundraisers say, well, I don't have cute puppies. I don't have sick kids. I don't, I've got like research, or I've got like, we're this foundation that preserves parks, or we're a library foundation. We're a little bit less. The stories that we're able to gather sometimes, not always, seem like, man, I want to make this more interesting. How can I do that? One of my favorite leads in an appeal that I've read was from a research charity, and it was a children's disease. So certainly you've got children, but the appeal very much could have been like, this family had a child. That child got this rare disease. The child passed away, and we're looking for funds so we can advance research on this rare disease that doesn't seem very plausible, that we'll solve it within our lifetime. That's sometimes what it sounds like. And instead, the letter started with, it was like, "Dear Mike, at her funeral, we released pink balloons into the sky." And what a way to have my attention right away, right? And it barely touched on the research piece, even though that is their main mission. It was mostly the story of this child and why they released pink balloons into the sky. And I still almost tear up when I'm just telling you that lead, like that one sentence, right? So what are some tactics we can use to take a cause that can be fairly clinical or unsexy or maybe boring? There's no value judgment there, by the way. I don't think any cause is boring. But what are some ways that we can liven up that story and make it interesting?
So let's start with the pink balloons. And I love that example, and it gets right at your heartstrings. And I think part of it is that one poignant detail. It's very specific, it's very real, it's very authentic to that particular story. So I think of a few years back, there was a boat with Syrian refugees that toppled over, and there were really young children that drowned. And all you could see and all you could think about is those neatly tied little red sneakers. It's a small detail that just grabs you at your heartstrings. The flip side of it, what can make a story really quite tedious, just like think of being cornered in the conversation, is too much detail. So what you leave out when it comes to telling a compelling story is just as important as what you leave in. And standalone, those particulars of the narrative might be interesting or fascinating, but it's sort of having that self-restraint to focus a little bit, because if you throw everything in the kitchen sink into it, you sort of lose focus, and it's no longer as easy to, it doesn't grab you in the same way. That small poignant detail kind of gives you something to hold on to. Overabundance of details, it's sort of like, okay, so this is too much. I don't know what to focus on. So it just kind of scatters you. Embrace the boring. I will say I've been known to use sports analogies as a shorthand for very complex things, right? So, inside baseball is a lot more easy to understand than some sort of policy that's complex policies, the discussions of which do not include the broader populace. It's inside of baseball. So if you're able to speak in the human speak and not pedantic, not, policy heavy or science heavy, I think bringing it down to that accessibility level is really key. What else do we do and then I think it just comes down to both answer to your question about what makes for a good story and what makes for a story that's not boring, it's the why. It's not about the actual thing. In marketing, there's a saying, don't tell me about your lawnmower, tell me about my lawn. So when we talk about research, the impact of that research on human life, when we're talking about library, it's not just the description of the building, but what it means to people who walk through its front doors. So it's really connecting it back to the human impact, because, if we're doing an activity and we're not sure about the positive impact it has in the world, we may want to kind of backtrack and rethink what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a library foundation in our academy program, which is a training program for nonprofits, a year-long sort of cohort. And they posted this, they're listening, they posted this lovely appeal. And it wasn't about how libraries sort of have books. It started with this quote about, like, when I walk into the library, I feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, you're like, okay, how come you don't feel safe when you're not at the library? What's going on there, right? And so sometimes just focusing on the negative consequences, if your org wasn't around, if you're preserving a park and you're having a hard time finding compelling stories, well, what would happen if you weren't around to preserve that park or that piece of nature? What would happen then? Because that's also a story, right?
Well, it's connecting it back to our values, what matters to us, and aligning with those values, because ultimately we give because we want to see a change that we consider to be important, right? So to what end? So
all right, so we've gathered some stories, and we know that we're going to write a story that has peaks and valleys. We can maybe look at the 7 archetypes of a good story and see if we can find something there that might make sense for our story. But we really want to advance the plot by having a bit of tension, a bit of drama. It can't just be like this happened and then that happened and then this happened and then the story is over. You've got to advance the story, pull back a little bit, introduce a new problem. It's got to feel dynamic, kind of like a movie does, right? Where every few minutes something happens to advance the plot. We're being very ethical about how we're going to gather the story. We're asking questions like, well, how did this person feel? How did it make them feel? What would have happened if they wouldn't have access to the service? What's at stake? Now we're going to actually use the story to engage donors. And I think we all think about storytelling as appeals and newsletters and emails, that sort of thing. What ways can we use stories to engage donors? Because there's like thousands of ways that we don't often think about.
no, literally. I mean, if you have major donor staff, do they have stories in their back pocket that they feel comfortable retelling? If it's a newsletter, if it's a conversation with the CEO, if it's a podcast. I mean, stories are really everywhere. So yes, appeal, but also everything else that surrounds it. I mean, how you use it, is it just a quote, or is it a full-blown story, or is it a 17-minute documentary? I mean, that will depend on your context. But I think it really starts with, what is the takeaway, to what end? Every story needs to start and end with, what is the purpose in telling that story to convey, and then applying it really across the board, I think, is really important. So, and also, Mike, I appreciate how you summed up everything we discussed. And I mean, I think it applies not just in our professional lives. I mean, I think that applies in our social lives, in our personal lives. I mean, that's really kind of the blueprint for engaging storytelling. When you're having conversations, I mean, there's nothing worse than, and then this happened, and then this one other thing happened, and it's just sort of like, get me out of here. So where is this all going? And again, just reminder, you don't have to lay out every detail, every piece of information on the table, like hold some of it back, maybe.
Yeah. I've got this 8-year-old kid who's very spunky, and she'll come home from school and she'll be like, Dad, you will never guess what happened. And I'm into it. And then it's like the most boring thing. It's like, Noelle did this and then that and then this. And it's like, man, you had a great hook and you lost me quick, kiddo.
Right. No, I mean, and it's in a child, it's sort of like they're your kid, but even then your thoughts start drifting, if you're being honest. But yeah.
Right. And the flip side of that is she will tune out so quickly if the story isn't interesting that I tell her. So it's actually a good test. If you've got a story that you're going to want to tell to a donor or an appeal, try telling it to your 8-year-old kid and see if you manage to keep their attention. Yeah. They're good judges of a boring story.
Mike, my kids are master storytellers. They came home from school and they told me the story of this kid who fell off the monkey bars and he broke his arm, but maybe it was his leg and maybe it was both. So, there was this very suspenseful thing with helicopters practically airlifting this child, but I think it was just a broken arm.
Amazing. One of the ways we're underutilizing stories is in all the little interactions we have with donors that are not primarily story driven. So a donor might call your org and they might say, hey, I want to update my address. And the person says, fantastic. Let me just log into the CRM. Okay, looks like you're here. Okay, we've changed it for you. Anything else I can do for you today? They're like, no, thank you very much. And that phone call is over. Now, what if they call to change their address and you do that whole thing and you change their address and you say, and by the way, I just wanted to quickly tell you this happened last week or this happened, like a 1 or 2 sentence story. And isn't it cool that you're part of that? Thank you for being part of this organization. I just had to tell you because it's such a cool story. So if we all have these stories up our sleeves in moments that are even very transactional, perfunctory with donors, we get to add a little story. That would make that would do so much to position our organization as being like a really human, loving, caring, dynamic sort of place that you want to be in touch with.
Mike, I would actually flip the script on you a little bit. And, when somebody calls your donor helpline, it's also an opportunity to ask a question. While I have you, I'd love to know more about why you care about our mission. I think as communicators, we're guilty of broadcasting, but not always kind of listening. And, part of communication is listening. So it's also a great chance to, as much as we connect in telling to stories that we hear, when we share our own, a piece of ourselves, whether it's with a person or an organization, we feel even more tethered to them and even more connected. So it's really an opportunity to also engage them in that dialogue and see what they have to say and maybe capturing some information along the way.
Yeah. Let's talk about how to use stories to retain staff.
Yes, let's
go for it. Here to listen and learn.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Well, I think it just sort of comes right down to it. We spend so much time thinking about strategies for fundraising and how to optimize our segments and how to craft the perfect narrative, but the people behind it, really our staff is probably the most valuable and most impactful strategy that you can develop. And people are people. We don't give the same consideration to our colleagues and employees as we do to donor segments. So are we reflecting their values in the work we're doing? Are we reminding them and aligning behind the purpose? Are we talking about our mission in the work we do? So we're out of that drudgery and reminded of why we're there in the first place. And it's really, a sense of belonging is the word that I always think of. How are you reflecting me? What is my story in my place of work that I give sweat, blood, and tears? Well, hopefully not blood and tears, but how are we reflecting?
Well, anybody who set up chairs for a gala knows that there's sometimes blood involved.
Sometimes
we've all jammed our fingers somewhere. Yeah.
Yes, that's true. But I think it's really just, who we are as an entity, as an organization, how we're reflecting the very people that make up this organization, how we're reflecting their values in the purpose of the organization and what it does. So I think internal communications a lot of times doesn't get as much attention as it deserves, but it really should be. And, I actually was recently looking at trends for, what are the new up and coming things in fundraising space and nonprofit space. And a lot of it is about staff. A lot of it is about staff retention, the difficulties in hiring staff. And, I think there are varying numbers. One number I've seen recently was 18-month tenure for fundraising staff. That's just over a fiscal year. That's not a whole lot. So I think in listening and being empathetic to who our staff people are and reflecting it in what we do, I think is really important.
Yeah. I've told this story before on this podcast a few times, but over 10 years ago, working at this organization, I had a hard time gathering stories that I needed for PR, for all sorts of stuff. And so one of the ways to try to sort of build better relationships with program people who I was reliant on to get stories was to every week send out an email about donor feedback we received. So the thing where you're on the phone, you ask a donor and then you record those quotes. So we would start just like sending that to the entire org to encourage people to realize that the work that you do, there's thousands of donors out there who are so thankful for the work that you do. And things got really busy. I did that for about a year, I think. Things got really busy. I just stopped doing it for a while. And then program staff would come by the desk and they'd be like, so any donor stories lately?
Yeah.
You're like, okay, yeah, that's awesome. You got used to it and you you actually liked hearing that and it made you feel better about your job.
I love that example because it really reiterates your value. It makes you feel appreciated, because appreciation, yeah, a gift card or a pizza party is nice, but nothing reinforces appreciation and feeling motivated to do what you do, like seeing the impact of your work. So I think that's a great example. And also just connecting, I think recently we've talked about no mission, no money, no money, no mission, and it's integrating the two.
Yeah, this goes back to what you said about dopamine and oxytocin. And it's like a pizza party feeds my belly, but the stories you tell me, they make me feel real good inside. And
Yeah.
that's almost more important than the pizza party, right? I can go get a pizza by myself, but I hearing the story about the kind of person I am and reaffirming my identity and my values and my place in the world and in this organization, that's priceless and it's free. Like, as leaders, we get to do that for free, right? It doesn't cost anything to reflect back the stories of your people.
Yeah.
Can you just riff more on that? Like just
I'll riff.
Yeah.
I think in everything we've talked about throughout today and in what you're describing about staff, I'm going to come back to authenticity and being just very, very real. So if it feels remotely fakey or pandering or, that's a turnoff. So I think in kind of telling the stories, it's sort of doing a gut check. Does this feel real? Does this feel authentic? And tuning out external voices of what you're supposed to do and just really kind of connecting to your heart, I think is really important. We didn't talk about it in donor stories, but certainly, as a writer, and everyone can be a story gatherer, but when you're actually telling the story, the more you feel in the process of writing, I have found, the better the outcome is. And it can be draining, right? Like there definitely, if you're spending an afternoon writing on a particular subject, it's sort of buckle up, it's going to be bumpy. But the more you feel, the more real that emotion comes on the page, and you're sort of the conduit for it. So I think as leaders, just doing that gut check, if it feels real, so it's not kind of on repeat the same story. And it's also adding some of your own, as a storyteller, some of your own emotion in telling the story, right? So not just feeling it, but actually sharing, when I hear this, this is how I feel. So it's putting your own humanity in retelling of that story.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna open it up to some questions in the room, and so Becky and Caitlin, I know, have been in the chat collecting some of these stories. But Becky, we'll pass the mic to you, and you can moderate some questions.
Mike, while she does that, this is the first podcast you've done where the word moist was used?
You broke the moist ceiling. Yeah, this is the first time anybody has used the word moist. Yeah. And I did have a visceral reaction the moment you said it.
As did Becky just now.
Well, just the phrase moist ceiling, that gave me a whole other layer to bring it to. So thank you both. So we've got a bunch of questions in the chat, which is awesome. I think that says a lot about how people really connected with what you said today, Olga. First, we have a question from Celeste. What are your thoughts about changing the names of the people whose stories you are telling or making it anonymous? Do you have any advice on that? Something you like to do or don't like to do?
Hi, Celeste. Well, I think it's a judgment call. And I think it's, again, comes back to respecting the wishes of the person. I think if you are changing the names, just a little asterisk to just indicate that the names are changed, their only first names are used. I think that's important. Where I do find a little bit of a challenge, and you sort of have to kind of look for that. If there's a photo that seems like could be the person, but it's not the person, change it up or disclaim that this is not an actual person. I think that can be very visually, if not misleading, it can be confusing. So just making sure that the person is not looking at the stock image and assumes it is the subject of the story.
Does anyone have any follow-up questions to that? Dump them in the chat or just speak up if you do. While you're thinking about that, we have another question here. Jenny is wondering, how important is the readability level in your writing, Olga? Talking about, fourth grade or eighth grade, making sure it's at a specific standard.
Yeah. So, your audience best, right? So there's certain organizations where, fifth grade level certainly will not fly, but it's sort of go as simple as you possibly can, but no simpler than necessary, right? So I think you have to consider your audience. I would also consider if you're using big complex words to kind of obscure what you're really trying to say, I think that can be a little bit of an issue. And I certainly, I kind of look for that when I'm writing. If it's not clear because you don't know what you're actually trying to say, it's time to simplify and kind of clarify your thoughts before putting pen to paper. But simplicity in my book is always the way to go, because it's harder to do simple than to write in a complex way. And it just sort of forces you to distill to the most essential and most basic things.
Yeah, we work a lot on this, even with audiences that are fairly sophisticated. Let's say your donor audience is lawyers and doctors who all have like 10 or 15-year degrees and who can handle big words. A lot of the time, by the time they're interacting with your email or your letter or your whatever it is, their brains have had it's been a day.
Right.
And so a way of serving people is making it, just like Olga said, as simple as you can. It's a way of serving them to very quickly understand how they fit into the story, why you're writing them, what are you asking them to do, what can they do, without making them burn all these mental calories. And that's not saying that donors are in any way not sophisticated or smart. In fact, the more sophisticated and smart, sometimes the less time they actually have
and attention
to consume a lot of other stuff.
Sort of write it and then simplify it if you can. I was reading something about studied dissonance of privilege. Like, I was like, what are you really trying to say? Like, just distill it down to what you're trying to say, and say it in the simplest way possible.
JFK in the 60s wanted to convince him, or he did, to invest in the space program, right? They were going to use all this tax money for it. It was pretty cool because the space program was sort of the most technologically advanced thing anybody on Earth was doing at that point. And he could have talked about the engineering behind rockets. He could have talked about, like, this tube they were going to build and all this technology. Instead, he went on national TV and he said, we're going to put a man on the moon. That's like grade 3 language.
Yep.
Like, the man on the moon is, like, that's like a children's book. And that sentence sort of like rallied this entire nation to get behind it. I'm sure his engineers were like, but you didn't tell them about the tech behind it.
Well, it's the vision, right, that paints the vision. I mean, I would have amended the word man to be a person, but that's just me.
Awesome. Well, we have another question here that I think is going to have some follow-up ones as well. It's a great question from Dan, a big question. Olga, what is your advice for melding together personal stories and institutional information in an appeal? Or should they be separate packages for donors who are motivated differently?
So, I mean, I think it's a little bit of a judgment call, right? I don't think it's all or nothing. Like, here's the emotional story part of the program, and here's the statistics. I mean, if I'm sitting down to write, I probably would take either the approach of where I'm telling the story, and somewhere in there I throw a few nuggets of information, so just really kind of seamlessly. In some packages, maybe the package is the story, and then you have like a call out box with a mini infographic that highlights some of the achievements and things like that. Or maybe the letter actually bullets out the stats that you want them to be aware of, or particular impactful highlights, and then doing an insert of some sort if we're talking about mail with an individual story. So I don't think it's all or nothing. And I think you can be credible without, I come back to what you leave out. 1 or 2 statistics are great. I'm not sure that you need to kind of put the kitchen sink in there. What is your most compelling stat? And don't make it so overwhelming that it's just, wait, do these numbers add up? Do they jive together? Throw a few. And also, there's a way to make numbers compelling. I remember writing for a cancer survivorship organization, and the number of millions of survivors, it's hard to wrap your brain around. But when you put it in the context of, well, that's as big, it would be the, I think, 5th or 6th biggest state in the United States. That's the number, right? Like, it's as big as Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or whichever state we were using. So I think that's a way of also putting statistics within the story, kind of wrapping the story around it. And it's not story in the traditional like narrative sense, but you're kind of creating a story with that particular statistic.
Awesome. Any follow-up questions, Dan?
No, that was great. Thank you, Olga. Appreciate it.
That's probably something that a lot of us as people who are writing for organizations struggle with, that dance between how much do we include here, how much do we highlight the story. So thanks for explaining that. We've got another question here from Jill. Jill is wondering, how do you work through the dance of getting the subject's approval? And Jill is here. Jill, would you like to tell your real life scenario you've got in the
Hello,
question?
Jill.
Yes, Olga, good to see you.
Hi.
About 2 years ago, we were telling the story of a veteran living with ALS, and she was amazing. She made us laugh and cry as we interviewed her for multiple hours, and summed that up into a 2-page solicitation letter, sent it to her for her approval. And the drama was reduced and the details were greatly added. And we wanted to honor her and respect her story, but it wasn't the retelling, it wasn't her biography. It truly was. And so we honored it, but we all just felt like it fell a little flat. It didn't have that same impact. So someone on my team said we should have changed the words. Instead of asking her for her feedback, just say more like, does this work for you? And I didn't feel comfortable doing that. I really wanted, after spending so much time with her, I really wanted to honor and respect her. But what would be your recommendations going through that situation?
Well, I mean, that's such a good example when people sort of change their mind and, or everyone thinks that, it's their story, but it doesn't necessarily make you authority on presenting your story. Sometimes I would just cut my losses and stick it in some newsletter somewhere. I mean, it sort of, yes, it's a lot of time that's been invested, but sometimes that's what you just have to do. I think in how you present it to the subject, and it's hard to tell up front, like some people are just great, good to go. And others, to your point, just really go a little bit haywire with edits. It's hard to know up front which ones they will be. So there is definitely that risk. And I think sometimes you just sort of, well, we tried, this didn't work. What's our plan B? So, oh, you're on mute again.
Oh, I just had to yell at my son to get out of here.
Did he?
I mean, ask him nicely. I think I didn't expect her to be this way. And the next time we wrote a solicitation letter a few months later, the next person we were highlighting, we were like, oh my gosh, she's going to rewrite the whole thing. And the next day she was like, looks great, good to go. And we were shocked, but I didn't know if she was maybe offended by the level of emotion we were bringing out by really talking about all the things she'd accomplished in her life as a veteran, as an attorney. Like she had such amazing stories. We didn't have time to put everything in, but again, it really dropped the drama and felt a little bit flat, we felt.
Humdrum. Well, maybe the attorney piece, no offense to anybody on the call, put you off, but yeah, I mean, it's hard to know up front, and we change our mind for any number of reasons, right? So I think sometimes it's just sort of like you try and then you strike out, and it's sort of like, okay, what's next? So it's actually a good reminder to keep a few things in your back pocket that you can rely on and pull out. I think what you said in how it's presented to the person, and that relationship best, and just sort of presenting it as like, hey, as FYI, I wanted to share this, wanted to make sure everything is accurate. In other words, we're not asking for creative input, but we're asking for accuracy. Anything that you find to be, offensive for some reason, it's kind of pulling that out.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Jill, I'll add, I don't know if you have the budget, but we're certainly in that situation quite a bit. And so I think you did the right thing by having that person sort of approve the final story and using their own words. We would probably try to put that in a lift note in that case. So there's the letter. It'll have some quotes from the person. It'll make a strong case for support. And then there's an additional lift note or buck slip where it's just like the person in their own words. And sometimes we make that kind of a journal entry or something, like it looks like this note that the person wrote. And they can be as detailed as they want to in that note. And it's completely in their own words. It's a direct quote. That's sometimes a way to both honor the story fully and still have a strong sort of letter or appeal.
The other thing is, I mean, video, you don't get to go back and redo it. So video is always great for that too. Once you have it, you have it.
I think that was a super helpful question. Christine, I just want to call out her addition to the chat here. She says, in situations like Jill's scenario, I explain, just give a quick overview how direct mail works and how telling this person's story in an impactful way will help so many more people. That usually helps them trust us to tell the story in the way that will raise the most money. And that's exactly right, because to a beneficiary, fundraising is something totally new. So that's really helpful, Christine. I have a quick question for you, Olga. What do you suggest for when you find yourself in a story drought and it just feels like either you're not getting the content that you need, that you think is really going to resonate with the direct ask that you want to make, or when the stuff that's coming in just isn't quite there? I think, we all struggle with this sometimes. So I'd love to hear your suggestions for those moments.
Yeah, so a couple answers. That's such a good point. I mean, I mentioned building relationships with your colleagues who become your story gatherers. They're the ones that are on the ground and sending you the leads. They're not writing it, but they're, hey, I heard about this thing, FYI. I think the other piece of it that's really important is to always have your listening ears on. And sometimes there will be a thread of something, and it's not quite a full fleshed out story, but you start tugging at it and, tucking it away, and then it can become a much stronger narrative. And then I try to write things down. I try to keep track of ideas and prompts, because you'll be doing something completely unrelated and a great idea pops to mind, but then when the time comes, you will never be able to remember it if you don't put it down somewhere. So I try to just keep track, and some of these ideas will never see the light of day, but if I'm in a drought, it gives me, here's my list of 20 things to go back to. Which ones we can go back to. And then if in doubt, I mean, I guess retelling the same story that you've told before, what's old is new again. If it's been a while, maybe that's the way to go. But, in that order, I would say talk to your colleagues first.
I just want to shout out Dan. Dan had a follow-up to the previous point, which is if somebody's writing something in their own words, starting it off with, I never thought I'd write a fundraising letter, but here I am. That kind of buys you a bit of grace, because it's the person sort of saying, yeah, I know this isn't maybe your typical fundraising letter. This is my story. Olga, this has been fantastic. If people want to follow you and learn more, where can they go?
I think LinkedIn is always good. I'm most active there. Don't waste your time on Instagram with me. So Olga Woltman on LinkedIn. Yeah, that's probably the best way to do it.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on Build Good Live today.
Wonderful to see you, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for all of you for being in the room today. That's all for today. I took a bunch of notes, so here's my short action plan for you. The short action plan for you is to have a bunch of stories in your back pocket. I think that is a key takeaway from today, is you can use these stories in a whole bunch of places. So as you go about your day, there are stories in your organization everywhere. You hear them from people. You hear them at break. You hear them at lunch. You hear them if you hang out at reception for 10 minutes and you just listen to donor phone calls. There are stories everywhere. And as a fundraiser, you are a merchant of joy and you are a merchant of stories. And if you can gather these stories and use them effectively, not only can you help your organization raise more money, you can help the people around you feel better about their jobs. And that will make the whole thing funner and easier, and people will stick around longer because you're handing out like hits of dopamine and oxytocin and making people feel like they belong. If you want to be part of future Build Good Lives, just go to buildgood.com. There's different places to put in your email address. Secret, they all go to the same place. So sign up for something. You're on the invite list for Build Good Live. We'll be sending you an email just reminding you on Friday, hey, on Wednesday, we've got a Build Good Live coming up. And you'll also get some tips and tricks along the way as we're learning stuff. If you're listening to this, you're my kind of people. I'm your kind of people. Thank you for the work you do. I'm your host, Mike Dirksen, cheering you on as you do good in the world.